In small-town America, there are places that look too perfect to question quiet streets, smiling faces, and history that never seems to change. But behind the church picnics, the preservation grants, and the handshakes that last a little too long, something darker waits. These are towns built on secrets, communities where charity turns to corruption, faith hides a body count, and tradition means control at any cost. From Montana to Vermont, Alabama to Kansas, these 4 stories expose the rot beneath the surface, the fellowship that used God to murder, the preservation society that buried more than history, the business alliance that ruled through fear, and the committee that decided who deserved to exist. Each promised safety, belonging, and order. Each left behind silence, graves, and ghosts that still whisper through their perfect streets. Welcome to Scary Stories, where small towns keep their darkest truths locked behind friendly smiles. Angela Morrison never expected her life to change when she received the letter that arrived in a plain white envelope bearing a Montana postmark. It was a quiet Thursday morning in Denver, the kind of late spring day when the air feels heavy with rain that never quite comes. Angela had just returned home from work when she saw the letter sitting on her kitchen counter among grocery store flyers and credit card offers. The return address belonged to a law office she had never heard of, but what caught her attention was the name written neatly on the envelope, Estate of Ruth Morrison. Her great-aunt Ruth was little more than a faint childhood memory, an elderly woman she had met once at a family reunion when she was 12 years old. Ruth had been polite but distant, a gray shadow in the background of family photographs. The kind of relative who mailed $5 bills and Christmas cards but never called or visited. Angela could barely remember the sound of her voice. That was why the letter felt so strange, like something out of a dream reaching across decades. The letter was brief. Ruth Morrison had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 91. As her only surviving relative, Angela had inherited her property in Riverside, Montana, a farmhouse, 20 acres of leased land, and a modest savings account. The letter was signed by a lawyer named Harold Perkins, who invited her to come to Riverside to discuss the details in person. For several days, Angela could not stop thinking about it. Her life in Denver was comfortable but uninspired. She worked as a marketing coordinator for a mid-level firm that specialized in insurance advertising. Her apartment was small, her social circle limited, and her most reliable companion was the soft hum of her laptop screen late at night. The idea of inheriting a house in a remote part of Montana felt like a spark in an otherwise colorless existence. After a weekend of thought, she decided to take a month's leave from work. She would drive to Montana, settle her great-aunt's affairs, and maybe enjoy the quiet for a while before deciding what to do with the property. The drive from Denver to Riverside took her through landscapes that seemed to stretch forever, rolling grasslands, distant mountains fading into haze, and long ribbons of road that disappeared into endless horizons. By the time she reached the small wooden sign that read "Welcome to Riverside, population 423, she felt as though she had crossed into another world. The town was small enough to miss if you blinked. A few blocks of old brick buildings lined the main street: a diner, a hardware store, a post office, and a grain elevator that towered above everything else. Great-Aunt Ruth's house sat at the far edge of town, a 2-story farmhouse with chipped white paint and a sagging front porch. A large oak tree shaded the front yard, its branches heavy with the scent of early summer. Harold Perkins, the lawyer, met her there. He was a soft-spoken man in his 60s with a calm voice that made even legal language sound gentle. He explained that Ruth had lived in the house for over 60 years and that she had been a respected member of the community. Most of her time, he said, had been devoted to a charitable organization called the Riverside Fellowship. It operated the town's food bank, homeless shelter, and various community programs. She believed deeply in helping others, Perkins said as they walked through the creaking hallway filled with family photographs and the faint smell of old books. The fellowship was her life's work. Angela thanked him, accepted the keys, and promised to contact him once she decided whether to keep or sell the property. That night, she slept in a guest room upstairs, listening to the wind moving softly through the fields. The silence was both peaceful and unsettling, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Over the next few days, Angela began to explore the house. It was filled with decades of accumulated memories, furniture from the Depression era, boxes of letters, and carefully labeled photo albums documenting Ruth's long involvement in community events. In nearly every photograph, Ruth appeared beside members of the Riverside Fellowship. Smiling faces in front of church buildings, food drives, and holiday gatherings. But something about the pictures bothered Angela. The smiles looked practiced. Standing close, their eyes reflecting an emotion that was hard to name. Devotion, perhaps? Or fear? On the third day, Angela received a visit. A man in a neatly pressed gray suit appeared at her door carrying a casserole dish and a sympathetic smile. He introduced himself as Pastor David Brennan, leader of the Riverside Fellowship. His voice was warm, his handshake firm, and his eyes the soft blue of someone used to inspiring trust. He said he had come to welcome her to the community and to express condolences on behalf of the fellowship. "Your great-aunt was one of our most cherished members," he said. Her kindness touched everyone in Riverside. He invited Angela to the fellowship's weekly community dinner, held every Wednesday evening in the basement of the old Methodist church. She accepted, grateful for a chance to meet people and perhaps understand what Ruth had cared about so deeply. The dinner was exactly what she expected, a small-town gathering full of chatter and warmth. Long tables were covered with checkered cloths and trays of pot roast and mashed potatoes. Elderly residents sat beside young families, everyone laughing and exchanging stories. Pastor Brennan stood at the head of the room, speaking about service, compassion, and the importance of unity. It was all so wholesome that Angela wondered why she had felt uneasy looking at those old photographs. When she mentioned that she was staying for a few weeks, several members encouraged her to volunteer. She eventually agreed to help at the fellowship's thrift store on Main Street. The store was managed by Carol Hendress, a cheerful woman who spoke quickly and smiled often. Angela spent her days sorting through donations, folding clothes, and arranging displays of used books and furniture. It was simple work, and at first, she enjoyed it. But after a week, she began to notice things that did not make sense. Certain customers, usually older men or women, would arrive quietly, exchange whispered words with Carol, and then disappear through the back door instead of exiting through the front. Sometimes Carol would slip into the storage area for several minutes, returning with a forced smile and no explanation. The back room itself was packed with far more boxes than the store could ever sell. and Carol insisted that the fellowship was always catching up on sorting. But Angela could tell that something else was happening there. Her unease deepened when she joined the fellowship's food delivery program the following Saturday. She was paired with Tom Martinez, a quiet man who handled one of the delivery routes. They drove an old white truck filled with boxes of groceries marked with the fellowship's logo. Their deliveries took them far from the town center, to isolated farmhouses and rundown trailers. Tom did most of the talking with the recipients while Angela waited in the truck. The visits always lasted too long, and each time he returned, he seemed more nervous. Once, she saw an elderly woman hand him a sealed envelope. He tucked it into his jacket without a word. That night, Angela could not stop thinking about it. Why were people giving envelopes to food delivery drivers? Why were some of them visibly afraid when the truck arrived? She decided to search her great-aunt's house again, this time with sharper eyes. In Ruth's bedroom closet, hidden beneath an old quilt, she found a small wooden box. Inside were handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and bank statements. The notes were written in Ruth's careful, looping handwriting. Some described her work at the fellowship. Others were filled with fear. One note read, "They are not what they pretend to be. I have seen what happens to those who ask questions." Another said, "The old ones are dying too quickly. They say it is natural, but it is not." The most recent note, dated 3 months before Ruth's death, chilled Angela to her core. "I know now. The food is the key. They are using us." Angela's heart pounded as she turned the note over. On the back, Ruth had written, "Evidence hidden in the basement wall, armed with a flashlight." Angela went down to the basement that night. The air was cold and heavy with dust. She tapped along the stone walls until one section sounded hollow. Removing a loose stone, she discovered a manila envelope stuffed with papers and photographs. The evidence inside was horrifying. Bank ledgers showed large deposits into the fellowship's accounts from unknown sources. Photographs showed packages being loaded into delivery trucks. There were even copies of death certificates, elderly recipients of the food program who had died of natural causes within weeks of their last delivery. Angela's hand shook as she flipped through the documents. There was also a journal, written by Ruth. It described how the fellowship had turned from charity to corruption. Pastor Brennan and his inner circle had begun using the food distribution network to traffic drugs across rural Montana, hiding the substances in boxes of groceries. Elderly recipients were used as unwitting couriers, instructed to pass along sealed donations to others. Those who became suspicious were silenced, some through threats, others through overdoses disguised as medical emergencies. Ruth had discovered the truth and planned to report it. Before she could act, she had written that she felt her home was being watched. Her phone tapped, her every movement followed. The final entry ended abruptly with the words, "If anyone finds this, do not trust Pastor Brennan." Angela realized she was in danger. If the fellowship had killed Ruth, they would not hesitate to harm her as well. She gathered the documents and photographs, locked them in her car, and drove through the night to Helena, where she went straight to the office of the state attorney general. There, trembling and exhausted, she handed over everything. The investigation that followed shook Montana to its core. State and federal authorities descended on Riverside. Pastor David Brennan and 12 members of the fellowship were arrested on charges ranging from drug trafficking to elder abuse and multiple counts of murder. Evidence recovered from the fellowship's records confirmed everything Ruth had written. Over 2 decades, the organization had been responsible for the deaths of at least 23 elderly residents across the region. Their deaths had been staged as natural causes, while their assets were funneled into accounts controlled by the fellowship. Even the local sheriff, Rita Valdez, was implicated. She had received regular payments from the organization in exchange for ignoring reports and falsifying autopsy results. The fellowship's entire network of charity programs was revealed to be a sophisticated cover for drug distribution and financial exploitation. Angela testified in court, her voice steady but haunted. She described how her great-aunt had uncovered the crimes and how fear had silenced her until death. Pastor Brennan sat expressionless throughout the proceedings, his calm demeanor cracking only once when the judge read the list of victims aloud. After the trial, Angela sold Ruth's property. She donated every dollar of the sale to legitimate charities that served the elderly and the poor. Riverside, once proud of its image as a model of small-town compassion, became a place people whispered about but seldom visited. The old church where the fellowship had held its dinners was boarded up. Weeds grew through the cracks of the parking lot. The farmhouse still stands at the edge of town, its windows dark and empty. Locals say lights sometimes flicker inside late at night, though no one has lived there since Angela left. Some believe it is only the wind through broken glass. Others say Ruth's spirit remains, guarding the evidence she died to reveal. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: the Riverside Fellowship was never about faith or charity. It was about control, about greed, and about how evil can hide beneath the warmest smile and the most comforting words. And in Riverside, Montana, that truth came too late for those who believed in the promise of kindness that was only ever a mask for horror. The Millfield Preservation Society, Vermont. Marcus Whitfield drove into Millfield, Vermont on a cold October morning, with a thermos of coffee and a folder of notes that seemed too thin for a front-page story. The assignment had sounded harmless enough when his editor pitched it in the newsroom. A tidy little piece about a town of 847 residents winning a state heritage grant. The words practically wrote themselves in his head as he watched the sugar maples flare red and gold against a pale sky. Stewardship, preservation, generational pride. He had done a dozen of these features. You take a photograph of a white steeple, you find a fifth-generation shop owner who still sweeps his sidewalk every morning. You mention the grant money in paragraph 3, and you send it all back to Burlington with a ribbon on top. Millfield was exactly what he expected from the windshield. It's a main street you could hold in your hands. Gas lamps that were probably electrified but still wore scalloped glass like jewelry. A church with a bell tower that had been painted the color of fresh cream. Houses with gingerbread trim and porches wrapped around them like careful arms. There were pumpkins on steps and chrysanthemums blooming in iron urns. He parked outside a tiny historical museum housed in a brick building that had once been a bank. When he stepped onto the sidewalk, the air smelled like wood smoke and damp leaves. It would have made a perfect postcard. Inside the museum, a woman with silver hair and a pearl brooch stood waiting with a handshake as polished as her smile. She introduced herself as Eleanor Ashworth, president of the Millfield Preservation Society. Her voice had the measured cadence of someone who had spent years speaking at podiums and fundraisers. She poured coffee into paper cups and led him past glass cases filled with Civil War buttons and buttered churns. The museum felt curated down to the shadows. Even the dust motes drifted in tidy shafts of light, as if they had been choreographed for company. Eleanor had a story for every photograph on the wall. This house had been built in 1871 by a mill owner whose son fought at Antietam. That storefront once sold saddles before turning into a general store and then a grocer. She spoke with pride about the society's work beginning in the 1960s, when a proposed shopping center outside town had threatened to pull people off Main Street. The society had fought to preserve the core, lobbied to add the district to the National Register, and over the years had secured money, volunteers, and a culture of compliance that kept everything just so. Residents could repair, repaint, and plant, but major changes required review and approval. Its result was here to see: Millfield preserved as if sealed under glass. Marcus took notes, asked soft questions, and kept his reporter's instincts tamped down like coals. He had learned that small towns sometimes bristled under scrutiny. He would ease in. He would write a pleasant piece and go home. He'd spent his first day in interviews that yielded clean quotes. The owner of the general store praised the society for keeping out big-box stores. A young couple who had moved from Boston said they wanted their children to grow up where people knew their neighbors by name. The librarian showed him a register from 1901 where patrons signed with careful penmanship that looked like lace. He took photographs of doorways, a hand-carved newel post, a row of clapboard houses catching late sun. Everything matched. Everything held. And yet, something uneasy moved under the paint. When he asked the clerk at Town Hall for copies of recent property transfers, she said there had been a fire in the basement years ago that destroyed some records, but she would see what she could pull. When he asked where families who had moved away might be reached for a round, quote, people smiled and shrugged. Oh, they went south or west, or to be closer to children, they said. No one seemed able to supply a phone number or an email address. Memory thinned at the edges. Conversations developed hairline cracks. On the second day, he met Deputy Jim Kowski in a cramped police office that smelled of old coffee and floor cleaner. Jim was a big man with careful eyes who had left Millfield for the army and then returned. He agreed to talk off the record. He kept glancing at the window, as if he expected to see someone pressed there, listening. "The Preservation Society has kept this place intact," Jim said. "They have done good work, and a lot of people are happy about it, but they have ways of getting what they want. If you paint a porch the wrong color, they will find a way to make the color go away. If you run a business that does not fit the aesthetic, permits take a very long time. If you push back, things happen. You might get a very friendly call about your property assessment. You might find that a contractor who promised to start Monday can no longer work in town. No, there are no laws that say they can do these things. You will not find a memo. You will hear about community standards, and then you will find yourself aligned with them, one way or another." Marcus wrote it down and asked if there had been threats. Jim lifted his hands in a gesture that was nearly a flinch. "I cannot give you what you want," he said. "The Preservation Society is generous. They fund our equipment. They sponsor the Halloween parade. They organize volunteers for storm cleanups. This is a small town. People wear many hats." He paused, then added quietly, "There was a couple who tried to open a cafe with neon signs and live music nights 3 years ago. They sold the building after 6 months. I do not know where they went. Everyone says they left for better opportunities. I do not have anything more than that." The line in Marcus's head shifted. The story stopped being about money and paint and regulations and became about pressure and silence. He decided to widen the circle. He drove to the county seat to read records that had not burned in a convenient basement fire. Courthouse smelled like oil, soap, and paper. Paid for copies of property transfers and sat beneath fluorescent lights with a highlighter in his hand. The pattern came into focus. For 2 decades, the Preservation Society itself, or limited liability companies tied to board members, had acquired more than half the houses in town. Sometimes it was straightforward, a sale at market value. Often it was not. Mortgages purchased from banks, foreclosures that moved with uncanny speed, sales for prices that looked like surrender. He cross-referenced names with state missing person reports. 12 individuals who had left Millfield after selling homes to entities connected to the society and had not been heard from by family again. The state cases sat in electronic drawers labeled adult, voluntary. There had been no obvious crime. They had left jobs. They had drawn out savings. They had not left notes. They were adults, and adults were allowed to vanish if they wanted. Except adults usually left something trailing behind them when they went. A forward address. A recurring charge. A voicemail greeting that went stale but still existed. These 12 had cut off like strings. He called relatives, found sisters and cousins. He listened to people who lowered their voices in their own kitchens. One woman agreed to meet at a diner 30 miles from Millfield. She stirred her coffee until the cream collapsed into brown. "My brother told me he had learned something about the society that made him afraid," she said. "He said it was bigger than zoning and paint colors. He died of a heart attack a week later in his basement, where he never went because his knees were bad. They cremated him very quickly. The will left the house to a trust I could not understand. I tried to ask questions and people told me that my grief was clouding my judgment." She searched Marcus's face. "I do not know what happened, but I know what did not happen." Back in his motel room, Marcus drew circles on paper. Money flowed into the society through donations and grants. Property flowed into the society through acquisition. People who raised questions flowed out of town and then did not flow anywhere else at all. The town clerk was friendly, but the files she produced were pale as bleached bone. He thought of the gas lamps at dusk, how the light held steady and tender in the glass. He thought of the photographs on the museum walls that showed the town across a century, and he realized they were always taken from the same angle, as if a photographer had been told exactly where to stand. He filed formal requests with the state for the society's nonprofit records. Expected a few days' wait. We used that time to request business filings. Heritage Transport Services appeared on a list of vendors with a quiet thud. The name meant nothing, but the expenditures attached to it were not small. Over 5 years, the society had paid the company more than $800,000 for restoration consulting and logistics. He searched for the company. No office, no employees, a registered agent in an office park that held nothing but mail drops. The only assets listed were refrigerated trucks. He slept badly and woke with the sense of a wire tightening. Refrigerated trucks had uses other than moving food. He tried to talk himself out of the thought that rose like cold water in his chest. He tried to tell himself about farmers markets and heritage pork and ice cream for summer festivals. He could not make the numbers behave. The trucks were too many. The invoices were too regular. The word restoration sat wrong beside a vehicle meant to keep something from rotting. He went back to the museum and asked Eleanor, casually as he could, about contracting. "The society hires a number of vendors," she said, smiling with the faintest hint of steel. "We support local business whenever possible." She shifted the conversation at once to a planned holiday display and a lantern tour of Elm Street. It was a neat redirection, so smooth a person might not have noticed it happen at all. He walked the town in the late afternoon, leaves collected in the gutters like coins. He passed the historical museum as Eleanor stepped into the street and waved at him with a smile bright enough to light the gas lamps early. Her hand looked steady. He thought about what might be steady under that hand if you were on the wrong side of it. Something about the town felt staged and inverted, as if the facade were the truth and the interiors held the lie. He went looking for the lie. He asked the funeral home director about cremations. The man gave him numbers in a careful monotone and tried to usher him out. He asked the hospital about deaths in transit. He asked the sheriff in the county seat about why missing adults are marked voluntary without interviews that mean anything. And the sheriff shrugged and said resources are finite, and if a person empties a bank account and gets on a bus, there is only so far you can chase the bus. On a gray morning, the nonprofit records came through. Marcus carried the bulging envelope back to the motel and spread papers across the bed. The numbers had the complacent logic of ledgers. The society raised money. Between the reassuring lines sat a small group of expenses that felt like pebbles in a shoe. Heritage transport services, security consultations, discretionary community outreach. He followed those threads as far as he could and hit the limits of what paper could confess. He called his editor and said, "I am not bringing you a charming feature. There is something wrong here." His editor told him to write what he could prove and to watch his back while he did it. He started drafting a version of the story that would slide into place without setting off alarms. He wrote about the grant, wrote about the gas lamps. He wrote about the society's long history, and then folded in mentions of acquisitions and soft power, the way a town could become a map that fit only one hand. He thought he was being careful. He put his notes in a second folder. He backed up photographs to a cloud server and mailed a flash drive to himself at the newsroom with a sneaky feeling that felt too dramatic for a tidy Vermont town, and yet not dramatic enough. The breakthrough arrived not as a leak, but as a crack in the floor. An employee at a neighboring town's public works office returned a call with a strange story. A refrigerated truck with Heritage Transport as logo had been stopped on a back road for a broken taillight last summer. The driver produced a bill of lading for historical fixtures. The officer who pulled him over had opened the door and smelled ammonia and something else, sweet and wrong. The officer wrote a warning and told the driver to get the light fixed. He made a note of the incident and filed it in a drawer, labeled miscellaneous. Marcus felt the world tilt in a way that could not be fixed by coffee. Refrigeration, ammonia, fixtures. He called the officer. The man was wary, then tired, then finally cooperative. He had thought about it too, he said. He had thought about it on his porch at night when the trees were black against the sky. He had told himself he was imagining things because imagining things was safer than other possibilities. Marcus drove back to Millfield at dawn with hands tight on the wheel. He did not try again for quotes. He did not ask Eleanor for comment. He checked out of the motel before anyone could ask questions. He drove down Main Street one last time. Eleanor stepped from the museum at that same moment, as if the town were timed to her pulse. She raised her hand in farewell. He raised his in return. He could feel his pulse in his throat as he passed the church and the gas lamp flickering. Even though the sun had cleared the trees, he kept going. He did not stop until he reached the interstate, and then he did not stop again until he was parked behind his newsroom with the engine ticking in the cool air. The story landed like a bell. He wrote with a clarity that comes when doubt burns off and leaves bone. He laid out the pattern of acquisitions, the missing persons, the vendor with no office, and a fleet of refrigerated trucks, the silence that overgrew the town like ivy. He avoided words he could not prove and chose the ones he could. He did not say murder. He said anomalies. He did not say trafficking. He said unexplained disappearances and overlapping financial ties. He named names, quoted numbers, and sent the piece down the hall to legal. The paper ran it on a Sunday when people had time to read and time to feel the cold work its way under their clothes. Phones began ringing. Not all at once, but steadily, like rain gathering into streams. Families called. Former residents called. A woman who had worked a night shift near the museum called to say that she had seen trucks backing up to the rear entrance long after midnight. A county inspector called to say that he had resigned 5 years earlier because he could not get into basements he was supposed to inspect. State police called the paper to ask for copies of documents. Federal agents called to ask for interviews. The investigation that followed pulled at threads until the quilt came apart. Subpoenas went out. Bank records were unsealed. Cemeteries in neighboring towns reported ashes interred under names that did not match any birth records. Heritage Transport's trucks were seized in a dawn sweep, their trailers opened in a lot where the wind shocked people into coats they had left in cars. The smell was worse in daylight. Forensic teams moved slowly and spoke softly, as if even words could bruise the air. Millfield kept smiling in photographs while the truth uncoiled in the spaces between them. What had looked like an obsession with paint colors and shutter styles revealed itself as a governance that had no ballot and no minutes. The Preservation Society had started as a bulwark against strip malls and ended as a cartel of respectability. People who threatened to vote the wrong way with their hammers or their mouths were persuaded, then pressured, then erased. The refrigerated trucks carried more than fixtures. The museum's basement, with its clean exhibits above, had concrete drains below. Paperwork had been meticulous. Death certificates marked natural causes. Bodies were not easy to find if there were no bodies. Arrests came like frost, spreading quietly at first, then whitening everything. Eleanor Ashworth was taken from the museum's front steps in a beige coat, her hair neat, her mouth dignified and hard. Board members were arrested in kitchens with tea kettles singing themselves dry. A funeral director was let out beneath a wreath on his door. A contractor who had serviced the gas lamps sat on a curb with hands cuffed and eyes fixed on a spot 1,000 miles away. In the affidavits, the words murder and trafficking finally appeared, typed in a black that felt heavier than ink. The public story became what it always becomes when horror is pulled out into the clean light. Numbers. The society was implicated in the deaths of at least 37 people over 2 decades. Transfers of property worth millions had been executed with forged signatures and fraudulent proxies. Adults who had vanished had not moved west to chase warmth. They had been taken downstairs and did not come back up. Human trafficking filled in the blank spaces where bodies were not found. The refrigerated trucks were the final handwriting on the wall. Marcus received a prize he had wanted as a young reporter and could barely feel as a middle-aged one. People congratulated him in the newsroom, crowded into the conference room with cupcakes, and clapped him on the back. He said thank you in a voice that sounded a little like someone else. He went home and lay awake staring at the ceiling until dawn pressed gray against the windows. He'd written sentences that made a difference. He had also taken photographs of a white steeple and a row of tidy houses, and now he could not look at anything painted cream without thinking of drains. Millfield did not vanish. Towns rarely do. The museum door is locked, and a sign in the window says closed until further notice in tidy hand lettering. Some houses stand empty now, their porches sagging a little more each winter, despite the grant money that was supposed to save them. Tourists stopped coming. Children who once rode bikes in circles on the courthouse lawn now ride them in other towns. There is a silence that is not simple quiet, but the sound of people choosing not to stand where a photographer once stood because the angle is wrong now and will be wrong for a long time. Sometimes Marcus drives past the exit on the highway and feels the old instinct to take it, to see if the light still blooms the same way on the clapboards at 4 o'clock in October. He never does. He knows that if he did, he might see Eleanor in the doorway of the museum as she had been that last morning, lifting a hand in a wave that was all graciousness and command. He might feel again the small animal certainty that smiled at him through glass and said, "You do not know us, and you do not need to." He would rather keep going north, past exits with names that do not mean anything to him, into hills where there are no gas lamps at all, and the leaves turn without permission or plan. He tells himself that is what he wanted from the start, a story he could fit into a neat frame, a town preserved. What he got instead was a ledger that proved how easily beauty can be lacquered over bone. In Burlington, he walks to work past buildings that have been modernized without asking the past to forgive them. Keeps a folder on his desk with copies of every document he used for the Millfield story. He opens it sometimes as if to make sure it is still there, as if the papers might decide to vanish the way the town's records did. He reads again the line from a bank statement where a house changed hands for a sum that made no sense. He reads the incident report about a broken taillight on a refrigerated truck. He reads his own story in print and knows that the sentences can never put the dead back into the timeline. There is some mercy in the fact that his job only asks him to find the words, not to resurrect what those words uncover. The people in Millfield who survived carry on with the precise noiselessness of a clock that has been wound too tight. They sweep their porches, they repaint. They say the town will recover because it has to. They say mercy, and then they look down at their hands. The state eventually releases additional funds for genuine preservation with oversight committees and audits that have teeth. New leadership tries to pull sunlight through every window, but there are rooms no one enters if they can help it. There are basements that fill with water when it rains, and when the pumps push the water out to the street, it looks a little darker than rainwater should, as if memory itself were dissolved in it. When Marcus thinks about Millfield now, he does not picture the steeple first. He sees the museum's basement as he has never actually seen it, because journalists are rarely there when the doors open, and the fluorescent lights buzz and people in white suits descend. He imagines the concrete rough underfoot, the drains, the scuffed path where a dolly would pass, the chalky marks on a wall where something leaned for a very long time. He thinks of a town that wanted to keep itself exactly as it had been and made a terrible bargain with the part of human nature that believes order is worth any price. He understands now that some places are preserved because time has been held back, and some places are preserved because someone is holding something else down. He writes other stories, sits at other kitchen tables, he learns new names and new maps. But every once in a while, when a source smiles too neatly, or a record set fits together a little too perfectly, he feels a cold draft from a door that is supposed to be shut. That is Millfield, he tells himself. That is the fall of a town that loved its own reflection so much it could not see what was standing behind it. He folds the feeling into the next paragraph and keeps going, because the work is to keep going, and because somewhere there is. Always a museum with dust like glitter and a shaft of light and a woman, and with a pearl brooch, in a town that will wave goodbye even as you realize you are leaving with something you did not come for and will never be able to put down. The Cedar Grove Business Alliance, Alabama. Tommy Rodriguez had been fixing engines since he was 17, learning the language of machines the way other people learned prayers. He could listen to a motor idle and tell you what it needed. He could rebuild a carburetor with his eyes half closed and his mind somewhere between focus and meditation. For 15 years, he worked under someone else's name, another man's sign above the door, another man's books collecting the profit. But he told himself that one day the bay would be his, the smell of oil and rubber his own, and the long hours would end with his name written above the window in neat black letters. That day came in early spring when he bought the old Shell station on Highway 6, squat concrete building that had been closed for years. He scrubbed the walls, painted the doors, replaced the cracked glass in the office, and hung a new sign, Rodriguez Auto Repair. The words looked proud against the weathered white paint. He took out a small loan, filled the garage with second-hand equipment, and told himself that honesty, hard work, and time would be enough. For a while, they were. Word spread quickly in Cedar Grove that Tommy was fair, reliable, and willing to explain repairs in plain language. He did not overcharge, he did not pad bills, and he did not talk down to anyone. Farmers brought in their trucks, teenagers brought in dented sedans, the local sheriff's department started sending vehicles to him for routine maintenance. Business grew slow but steady, like a tree putting down roots. Then, one hot afternoon in July, a black Cadillac pulled into the lot and parked right by the bay doors. 3 people stepped out, all in crisp suits that did not belong under that kind of sun. The man who led them had the confident stride of someone who never worried about being told no. He extended his hand with a salesman's smile. "Tommy Rodriguez," he said smoothly, as if they were old friends. "I am Frank Buchanan, Executive Director of the Cedar Grove Business Alliance." He gestured toward his companions. "This is Mayor Patricia Donnelly, and this is Charles Webb. He owns a few properties downtown. We wanted to welcome you to the community and talk a little about how we help local business owners like yourself thrive." Tommy wiped his hands on a rag and shook their hands, trying to read them. Their smiles were polite, but their eyes stayed cold and observant, like surveyors looking over a piece of land. Inside the office, they explained the benefits of joining the Alliance. They claimed it was an organization designed to support local entrepreneurs offering marketing assistance, connections to city contracts, and business protection services. The membership fee, Buchanan said, was $500 a month, with additional assessments for community projects. He spoke as if this was the natural order of things, like a tax you paid to keep the wheels turning smoothly. Tommy listened, polite but wary. Said he appreciated the offer but wanted to focus on getting his business stable before committing to anything. Buchanan smiled again, the same steady smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Of course," he said, standing. "Good, just remember, Cedar Grove works best when we all work together." The Cadillac left a swirl of dust behind as it drove away. Tommy stood by the bay door for a long time, the heat pressing down, thinking about that phrase, "when we all work together." A week later, the building inspector arrived. He claimed to be following up on a routine compliance review. He said Tommy, signage, might be too close to the road and that his oil disposal system needed updating. Tommy pointed out that the previous inspection, just 3 months earlier, had cleared him completely. The inspector shrugged. "New standards?" he said. "Nothing personal." Then came the fire marshal, who said the wiring was outdated. Then an environmental agent asking about storage of solvents. None of the violations were major, but the repairs added up to thousands of dollars. Each time Tommy fixed one problem, another notice arrived in the mail. His suppliers started missing deliveries. A local parts distributor told him that an internal review meant they could not extend him credit anymore. Customers who had once come every month stopped calling. One of them, a farmer named Collins, apologized awkwardly when Tommy ran into him at the diner. "Frank said you were having trouble," Collins muttered, unable to meet his eyes. "Said the Alliance was trying to help you, but you would not cooperate. I cannot afford to get caught in the middle." It went on like that small crack spreading through everything he built. He tried to ignore it, told himself it was just the way small towns worked, that maybe people were cautious because he was new. But deep down he knew. He had seen this kind of pressure before, when his uncle lost his grocery store in Mobile. There had been a business council there too, promising help and demanding dues. And when his uncle refused, inspections multiplied. Customers vanished, and one night, his store burned to the ground. Months after the Cadillac visit, Tommy's shop was broken into. Whoever did it ignored the cash drawer and the tools, but went through his filing cabinets, scattering papers on the floor. Someone was not looking for money, they were looking for information. The police officer who came to file the report was polite but dismissive. "Probably kids," he said, making quick notes. "It happens all the time." Tommy nodded, but he did not believe it. The locks had been picked, not forced. Whoever came in knew what they were doing. The next morning he found an envelope taped to the office door. Inside was a single sheet of paper, last chance to join the Alliance. No hard feelings. FB stared at the neat handwriting for a long time. Then he tore it in half, threw it in the trash, and went back to work. That afternoon, an older woman named Janet Morris stopped by. She had been one of his first customers, a retired teacher who drove an ancient Buick that he kept running with more care than sense. She looked nervous, glancing around before speaking. "I saw Frank Buchanan in the store," she said quietly. "He told me people who do business with you could face trouble. Said your permits are under review." I told him that is nonsense, but you know how people talk? Tommy nodded. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Morris." She hesitated before leaving. "You are not the first one they have done this to," she said. "A couple of years ago, the Wileys had a hardware store. They refused to join the Alliance too. 6 months later, their loan was called in, their insurance doubled, and then there was a fire. Everyone said it was an accident, but I do not think so. They left town right after. When she drove away, Tommy stood watching the dust from her tires drift across the lot. Something in his stomach turned to ice. He spent that night at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers, permits, invoices, tax receipts, letters from inspectors. He started building a timeline. Patterns emerged like ink bleeding through paper. Every business that refused the Alliance's offer either closed, burned, or changed hands within a year. The new owners were always connected to the same small network of shell companies registered to Alliance board members. He decided to dig deeper. At the county clerk's office, he asked for property transfer records. The clerk, an older man with sun-spotted hands, looked uncomfortable but fetched the files. The pattern was unmistakable. Dozens of small businesses, all bought out by limited liability companies tied to the Alliance. Some for pennies on the dollar. Some after accidental fires. Some after bankruptcies that seemed engineered. That night, Tommy called an old friend, Carlos Medina, who worked as an accountant in Birmingham. He explained what he had found. Carlos offered to help track the financial trail. 2 weeks later, he called back with news. "Tommy, they are laundering money," Carlos said flatly. "The Alliance is not a business association. It is a front for a protection racket tied to a trucking company out of Mobile. They use membership dues to disguise cash transfers from other sources. You are dealing with people who have muscle and lawyers." Tommy sat in silence, staring at the tools hanging on the wall. "So what do I do?" Carlos sighed. "You collect proof. You do not confront them. And you keep yourself safe." He started saving everything: letters, inspection notices, canceled orders, even gossip overheard at the diner. He bought a small camera and began photographing anyone who came to his shop asking questions. He also started recording conversations, hiding a small recorder in his pocket whenever he went into town. He spoke with other business owners quietly, testing the waters. Most refused to talk. A few looked like they wanted to, but were afraid. One man, who used to run a printing shop, finally agreed to meet him outside town. They met in the parking lot of an abandoned factory. The man's hands trembled as he spoke. "They forced me out," he said. "They said my designs were hurting the image of downtown. Then the zoning board came after me. Noise complaints, parking issues. They called in my loan. I tried to fight, but they froze me out. I sold to an Alliance-backed buyer just to keep my family safe." He told Tommy that the Alliance controlled not only the businesses but also parts of the police and the local government. Permits, inspections, even court filings could be delayed or accelerated depending on whether you cooperated. Resistance was punished through bureaucracy first, violence second. Tommy took notes, recorded every word, and then drove straight to Birmingham the next day. He walked into the FBI field office and asked to speak with someone about organized corruption. They put him in a small room with an agent named Rebecca Cole, who listened carefully as he told his story. She asked for documentation. He handed over everything: his notes, photographs, audio recordings, and copies of property records. When he finished, she sat back, thoughtful. "We have heard whispers about Cedar Grove," she said. "If what you are saying is true, this goes deeper than one town, but we need to verify it. Can you keep operating as if nothing is wrong?" Tommy nodded slowly. "I can try." The following weeks were a blur of tension. I kept working, fixing cars by day, while the FBI quietly began digging into the Alliance's financials. They found that Frank Buchanan had established more than a dozen shell companies linked to money laundering and racketeering. The Alliance funneled funds through construction contracts, falsified invoices, and manipulated town grants. The mayor had been signing off on zoning exemptions in exchange for cash. The group's business protection services were extortion payments by another name. Late one night, as Tommy closed the garage, a car pulled into the lot. 2 men got out, faces he did not recognize. They stood by the office door, hands in their pockets, watching him. "Mr. Frank wants to know if you have reconsidered." Tommy's pulse hammered in his ears. "Tell Frank I have nothing to reconsider." The man smiled faintly. "That is a shame." They left without another word. When Tommy came to the shop the next morning, one of the bay windows had been shattered. Inside, someone had poured motor oil over the floor, slick and black as ink. On the wall, written in Greece, were three words: join or burn. That was the breaking point. He called Agent Cole, who told him to stay calm and let the investigation play out. The FBI began surveillance operations in Cedar Grove. They tapped phones, traced bank transfers, and followed trucks tied to Buchanan's company. Within weeks, they uncovered evidence of extortion, insurance fraud, and arson for-profit schemes, stretching back more than a decade. The alliance had destroyed or absorbed over 40 small businesses in the region. When the indictments came down, it was like lightning splitting a summer sky. Federal agents raided the alliance's office, seizing computers and records. Frank Buchanan was arrested at his home. Mayor Donnelly was led away in handcuffs. Charles Webb turned himself in after learning warrants had been issued. The local news called it the biggest corruption scandal in Alabama's small-town history. Tommy was asked to testify. He sat in the courtroom, wearing his cleanest shirt, hands clasped to keep them from shaking. He told the story of how the alliance approached him, how the inspections began, how the threats came, and how he found the courage to stand up. When the prosecutor asked what made him decide to fight back, he looked at the jury and said, "Because my father taught me that a man who lets himself be bullied loses more than money. He loses his name." The trial lasted 3 months. The evidence was overwhelming: fraudulent contracts, hidden bank accounts, recordings of alliance members discussing accidents arranged for defiant business owners. Buchanan and the mayor were convicted of racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy. They were sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The others received lesser sentences, but Cedar Grove would never forget their names. When it was over, Tommy went back to his shop. Some people treated him like a hero. Others avoided him, afraid of the attention he had brought. But his customers slowly returned. The sheriff stopped by one morning to thank him, admitting that even the department had been under pressure from the alliance. He told Tommy the town was starting over, trying to build something honest. The black Cadillac was gone from Cedar Grove, its office windows dark and empty. New officials took over City Hall. The streets seemed cleaner, though maybe that was just the relief of sunlight falling where shadows used to be. Sometimes, when Tommy closed the shop late at night, he would stand at the edge of the lot and listen to the crickets in the grass. He would think about how close he came to losing everything, how fragile decency could be when power wrapped itself in civility. He understood now that corruption never looks like evil from the outside. It looks like a handshake, smile, and a promise of help. He kept his shop small, turned down offers to expand, and refused to join any new business coalitions. People called him cautious. He called it experience. On his wall hung a framed newspaper clipping from the day the alliance leaders were sentenced. The headline read, "Small-town mechanic breaks corruption ring." He had not done it for glory, but somewhere in the quiet hum of engines and the steady rhythm of honest work, he found something that felt like peace. And sometimes when the evening wind carried the sound of tires on the highway, he thought of that first visit, the Cadillac gleaming under the Alabama sun, 3 smiling faces offering him the future. Smiled to himself, shook his head, and whispered, "Not this time." The Harmony Historical Committee, Kansas. Dr. Sarah Mitchell believed history lived in the spaces people tried hardest to forget. She had built her career on uncovering what others had buried, stories that were too shameful, too dangerous, or too inconvenient to be remembered. When the small town of Harmony, Kansas invited her to write a book celebrating its 150th anniversary, she thought it would be a quiet academic project, a pleasant commission, chance to spend a few months in a rural community and produce something polished for their library shelves. She could not have been more wrong. Harmony was the kind of town that postcards try to capture, but never quite get right. White fences, tidy lawns, and a main street straight out of another century. There was no graffiti, no visible poverty, and not even a single boarded-up building. People smiled when she passed them on the sidewalk, and they waved as though she were already part of the community. It seemed perfect, too perfect. The historical committee greeted her warmly on her first day. They met in the basement of the public library, surrounded by neatly labeled boxes of town records and faded photographs. The chair of the committee was Councilman Robert Hayes, a tall man with a careful smile and the kind of posture that comes from years of small-town authority. His family had lived in Harmony since the town's founding. His voice carried the confidence of someone used to being listened to. "We are proud of our history here, Dr. Mitchell," he said, handing her a binder of project notes. Harmony has always taken care of its own. You will find that we value our traditions. At first, the work was ordinary. Sarah spent her days cataloging old photographs, scanning minutes from city council meetings, and piecing together the story of a town that had survived the Dust Bowl, the Depression, and 2 world wars with minimal visible damage. But even in those early weeks, she began to sense periods where the paper trail simply vanished. The late 1960s, for example, were missing almost entirely. No minutes, no newspaper clippings, no census records. It was as if the town had collectively agreed to forget an entire decade. When she asked about it, the librarian, Grace Peterson, smiled politely. There was a flood back in the 80s, she said. Ruined some of the archives. But when Sarah checked the building's maintenance records, there was no mention of a flood, no insurance claim, nothing at all. That was the first time she felt that chill and instinct she had learned to trust in her line of work. To fill the missing pieces, Sarah began interviewing longtime residents. Most were polite but evasive. When she mentioned the 1960s, their expressions grew tight. They would talk about the harvests, the weather, or the old church choir, but not about the people who had lived and disappeared during that time. Her first real lead came from an elderly widow named Mildred Allen. Mildred invited her into a spotless kitchen that smelled of lemon polish and stale cookies. When Sarah mentioned the missing families from the archives, Mildred looked away and began wringing her hands. They were not our kind of people, she said finally. They came from outside. They wanted to change things. What kind of things? Sarah asked. Mildred hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. Everything. That night, Sarah returned to her rental house, uneasy, but determined. She began cross-referencing property deeds, looking for ownership transfers from that period. What she found made her stomach tighten. In the summer of 1965, 13 properties had changed hands within 6 weeks. The previous owners' families, who had only lived in Harmony a few years, had all sold their homes abruptly. There were no forwarding addresses, no new records of residents anywhere in Kansas. They had simply vanished. The buyers were all the same older residents, many of whom had been members of the historical committee or their relatives. The prices paid for those homes were far below market value. She drove to neighboring counties to dig through old newspaper archives. There, in yellowed microfilm, she found scattered references that the Harmony papers had conveniently omitted. A few regional journalists had reported on a mass disappearance in Harmony during the summer of 1965. State police had investigated. 57 people gone, no signs of struggle, no remains, and no explanations. The investigation had lasted 3 months before being quietly closed. Officially, the families had relocated. Unofficially, everyone stopped asking questions. Sarah sat in the library parking lot long after closing that night, staring through her windshield at the soft yellow glow of the street lamps. Every story she uncovered seemed to fold back on itself like a curtain hiding something larger. She went back through the archives with new eyes. The same names appeared again and again in connection with community leadership: Hayes, Peterson, Wallace, Green. The founding families. They'd controlled every council, every committee, every decision for over a century. The town had no outsiders in positions of authority. Even the school board was entirely composed of descendants of the original settlers. The pattern was too deliberate to be coincidence. Harmony had been engineered to remain unchanged. When she confronted Robert Hayes about the missing records, his friendly demeanor faltered. "I think you are focusing on the wrong things," he said calmly. "We asked you to write a celebration of Harmony, not an expose." She kept her tone polite. "History cannot be selective, Councilman. If there was an event that shaped this town, it should be included." He smiled thinly. "Some history is better left in the past." After that meeting, the atmosphere around her changed. The librarian, once helpful, became curt and distant. Townspeople, who had waved before now, crossed the street to avoid her. Someone left a note under her windshield wiper that said, "Outsiders should know when to stop digging." She tried to shake it off, but the fear was real now. One evening, she was reviewing council minutes from the 1930s and found something. She had missed before a reference to the Harmony Compact. The note was brief but clear. Compact reaffirmed by committee vote. August 3rd, 1932. Compliance required for all new residents. She searched every archive for another mention of it, but nothing else remained. No details, no explanation. It's just that one line, repeated again every 25 years. The more she read, the clearer the picture became. The Harmony Historical Committee was not just an organization devoted to preserving history. It was a mechanism for control. It had decided who belonged and who did not, who stayed and who vanished. Every generation had its own compact, a quiet agreement to protect the town's purity and traditions, whatever that meant. Dor could not sleep that night. She kept hearing Mildred's voice in her head. They were not our kind of people. She started visiting the outskirts of town, looking for any traces of the missing family's properties. Most had been demolished and turned into fields. But one abandoned farmhouse still stood at the edge of a dry creek bed. Its windows were boarded and the roof sagged like a bent spine. Inside, under layers of dust, she found a child's toy and a photograph tucked into a cracked frame to parents with a little girl, smiling in front of that very house. On the back, someone had written, "Summer 1965. She sent copies of her findings to a colleague at Kansas State University and asked him to store them in case anything happened to her. She knew it sounded paranoid, but she could feel eyes on her everywhere she went. Cars idling too long near her house, the same faces showing up at the diner or the gas station. When she returned to the library to retrieve more documents, she discovered her access had been revoked. Grace Peterson told her the archives were temporarily closed for reorganization. The smile on her face was fixed, but her eyes said something else. Go home before you disappear too. That night, Sarah found a letter slipped under her door. It was handwritten on old stationery with the Harmony Historical Committee letterhead. Dr. Mitchell, your work here is complete. The committee thanks you for your contributions. We'll be handling the final manuscript internally. Please make arrangements to leave Harmony within the week. There was no signature. Sarah packed her belongings and left before dawn. As she drove through the silent streets, she saw Robert Hayes standing on the steps of the old courthouse, hands folded behind his back, watching her car pass. He did not wave. 2 months later, she learned that the committee had hired a local writer to finish the book. When it was published, it was filled with cheerful stories about harvest festivals, school pageants, and the unbroken spirit of Harmony's founding families. There was no mention of the disappearances, no word of the missing records, not even a hint that anything unusual had ever happened. The book was praised by the governor, and copies were distributed to every household in town. Sarah sent her notes to a journalist she trusted in Topeka. Weeks later, he called to tell her that several of the names she had mentioned, families who had moved away in the 1960s, matched old missing persons cases. The FBI had looked into them decades ago, but dropped the investigation due to lack of evidence and community cooperation. She hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. Some truths, she realized, were so carefully hidden that even when you found them, no one wanted to believe. Years later, she still thought about Harmony, the perfect lawns, the smiling faces, and the silence that lay beneath it all. She had learned that small towns can keep secrets longer than families, longer than churches, longer than generations. And she understood now what the compact really was. It was not written on paper or sealed in any courthouse. It was an agreement in the hearts of those who stayed, a promise to protect the illusion of perfection, no matter what it cost. Harmony still exists today, its streets as clean and its people as polite as ever. Tourists visit to admire the old architecture and buy postcards of the courthouse clock tower. They leave believing they have seen the best of small-town America. But for those who know the truth, Harmony is not a place of peace. It is a monument to the people who vanished for daring to ask the wrong questions. And if you walk down Main Street after dark, some say you can still hear faint voices in the wind, whispers from those who never really left, reminding anyone who listens that history is only silent when we agree to stop hearing it. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Every week, we uncover the hidden histories they wanted you to forget, the small towns, the smiling faces, and the dark machinery working behind them. Turn on notifications and join us as we continue digging through the quiet corners of America, where corruption and silence walk hand in hand.